Very true. Very true. Thank you for taking the time this early in the
Oh, no,
morning.
thank you guys. You're the ones providing the public service.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. My pleasure. I'm excited to answer all your questions. And then Trevor, I don't know if you want to stay on, you're more than welcome. If there's a way for me to transfer back over to host and keep it live streaming, then we can do that too.
Yep, I'll just make you a host and then drop off as soon as the live stream's
Okay.
going.
But feel free to stay if you'd like to as well.
All right,
I just don't want to take your time if unneeded.
No worries, I'll hop off. And
all right,
we're going. Have a good call.
Cool. Awesome. Well, just to introduce myself, I know we've spoken over email, but I'm Brittany Rohde, the Compensation and Benefits Manager here at GitLab. And I know that you had a couple questions around compensation and remote. So if you want to quickly introduce yourself, and then I'd love to kind of hop into your questions.
Yeah, totally. I'm Juan Mata. I'm the COO at Microverse, which is an online school for remote software developers. And we are also ourselves an all remote company. And I know very often these Pick Your Brain sessions are about the whole topic of remote, where GitLab is doing great service by publishing everything you guys are going through. So I do have, I think, like I said over email, more of a narrative set of questions. I know there's a lot of detail in the handbook, and I'm trying to get a little more of a high level perspective that I think will be useful for people.
Yeah, happy to. I've seen GitLab grow in a remote model over the last 3 years. So whatever I can help kind of explain or add a little bit more color to from there, I'd love to do so.
Wonderful. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll get into details. Like you and I were joking over email, we could spend probably the whole session talking about the calculator. Let's hope, we don't do that, because, but maybe we can start there, right? If you have that 3-year perspective, I think one of the things that I was mentioning being of interest is, what are the major phases that that you've seen GitLab go through? You maybe you didn't see the very, very early stuff. I think everybody does a pretty good job of the very, very early, founders working remotely, high trust relationships working very well. And then, what's like phase 2, phase 3, do you have sort of markers in your head that you've seen kind of the company go through?
Yeah, I think every marker is going to be a little different depending on the company. I missed this part of GitLab in deciding to be all remote. So I've, spoken with the team members that have been here for, since the beginning, and heard what they have to say around it. And it's a really cool story on, becoming remote by coincidence and also by, situation with people all over the world that came together, lived in the same house for Y Combinator, which I know Sid maybe doesn't recommend everyone do. There's got some good stories out of that too. But I joined GitLab when we were about 80 to 100 people. So it was back in 2016, and remote was already a big part of the culture, a big part of the company, and something that, we wanted to evangelize. And I bought into that for so many different reasons. I move all the time with my significant other's career. So for me, remote was really the only option. And I wasn't willing to give up, my career, my opportunities for growth solely because I had to move to different states around the US. And then to also get into a company like GitLab that had so many other things to offer, not just the remote piece, but a great company culture, a great product, and something that I really connected with, as well as great values. So I think the stage that I came in and saw was, how do you scale this remote company to maintain all of those things, to maintain that culture, which is going to change as you grow and change, of course, but maintain those values, but also be a great place to work. And so that's something that's been, really near and dear to us as we've gone from 80 to 100 people up to, close, I think we're just over 800 now, and looking toward 1,200 toward, the beginning of next year. And so there are different stages that go into those different pieces. And it's, a couple different things. The first piece that I missed was deciding to be remote. So making that decision and then building your practices around that, hiring not just within the same city or network that you're used to, but hiring, really diverse people, not only from different groups and different underrepresented backgrounds, but also from different countries. So taking that really global approach to diversity and inclusion, but then also maintaining and establishing that culture, communicating asynchronously, having flexibility in the type of work that you do and when you do that work, and then trusting people. I think that's the other biggest part, is if you build this great culture and you build this great, diverse, and inclusive population of people that you're working with, do you trust them to actually do the work they need to do? Otherwise, remote work isn't going to end up being very productive. And a lot of companies may fall backwards into setting up offices in, locations where they might have larger populations of people or things like that. And that's one thing that, we don't want to do, is set up an office somewhere. Just, we want to be remote.
So the face is sort of, in my mind, of course, we're actually going right through what you just described, being all in the house for YC, we're in this batch. And this is exactly where I think people start to get a little nervous, right? Yeah, we're committed. We want to be remote. We're going to do this. And then you start facing silly little issues as, well, where do we post this job? If we want to be a remote company, where do you guys post jobs so you get that pool of applicants? Where do you source your candidates? Or where did you? Now that the name is known, it might be easier, right? But where did you, when it was a small team, make sure that you had a good exposure in job postings?
Yeah, there's a couple different job sites that we would post them on, but we would actually post a lot on Hacker News as well.
Yeah.
So that was one place that we would get some really great candidates from. There's a couple different remote specific job postings, like We Work Remotely or remoteok.io, I think is some of the names of them. And then we'd also post based on, LinkedIn might have some different places. You can post a region instead of a specific area. But it can be difficult because a lot of the job postings do say, what's the location you want to hire in? And sometimes we would just fill that in as remote and let people apply.
Yeah, some places don't even have the option, but you're right. Now they're starting to wake up to the fact that remote should be a flag because it is a big calling. Yeah, Angel List has worked for us so far because we're in that super early phase. And also because you're really actually hiring from your network. So the job posting is only just kind of a placeholder where you can send people, but mostly you source. So in that phase, where small teams grow into sort of, let's say, from 5 to 10, there's this thing Sid says of like doubling every year, right? You almost, if things go the way you expect, you end up doubling every year. Would you say that there's any major markers, any major things that, this really needed to change? The way we were doing something really had to change, because as I committed to remote, that wasn't going to continue, scaling.
Yeah, I think for us, it was less around something needing to change and more what stays consistent and what's supposed to change. So as we've doubled over every year, and that's been very different from doubling, I'm sure, from 5 to 10 versus doubling from 200 to 400 as we went through those stages. And part of that was what part of our culture needs to shift to account for the fact that we're a 400-person company now instead of a 200-person company at that time, and what needs to stay the same. So for us, one thing that really rang true, and it wasn't so much a stage as it was just being very intentional around making sure that our values are something we live every day. So our values, we iterate. They're not the same as they were when we first started as a company, but there's a lot of the same themes, the same ideas, and the same thoughts behind them. And something that everybody at our company understands and knows about, because everybody has conversations around our values in every interaction. Hopefully, that's the goal. So when we talk about transparency and we talk about, having everything out there for the whole world to see, that's something that, even on the people team, which might be very rare for an HR department or people department to have every process, every policy out there, as well as, from an engineering perspective on, what's our product roadmap? When are we planning to IPO? All those different business initiatives that are public. That's something that we've kept along the way, even though at certain times it might have been really easy to say, okay, we're not going to be transparent anymore. Yeah. But whether you're an individual contributor or an executive, that transparency still is there and holds true. And that's something that, we've kept as we've scaled. And that goes for a lot of our other values as well. But having those daily interactions where everything comes back to our values and explains why we're doing things, explains why we have the goals and metrics and key performance indicators and objectives and key results that we have as a company, and helps explain why we're going where we're going. So, kind of a long-winded answer to say, what do you want to keep true and what should change? Because something is going to change. But what makes your company what it is, and what do you not want to let go of? And for us, that's, one piece of that is our values.
What's the process that you guys follow then? Because values is something that I would say the culture is one of those things that the more you talk about, the worse you're probably doing, because you're trying to fix a problem. What do you guys, do to revisit the the values to evolve them.
Yeah. So
they've changed, right? In which way do you guys reset the expectations around some of them?
Yeah. So we, everything at GitLab is open source. And so when we think that there is a change that needs to be made to our values, that can come from anybody. That can come from the wider community. That can come from team members at GitLab. It can come from our executives. It can come from myself. It can come from you. And so when we see merge requests come through, we review those and we say, does that align to where we want to go, to our values, that, how we want to see them iterate and change over time? And if so, we merge them, we communicate that. And typically it happens in like minimum viable changes. So I've never seen us go in and just adjust all of our values and say we're changing everything about our culture. That's not what GitLab is doing. And I think that signals a broader issue if that's what's happening. But for us, we've just taken small changes to say, okay, we're a 400-person company or an 800-person company now. Does this make sense still? And it's just happened over time and it's happened organically, but there haven't been huge pieces of conversation around what does this value mean and why do we have it? It's just part of ingrained into our daily work and our daily life at GitLab.
Yeah, maybe can you think of any one change like that? It's interesting to think of a value evolution as part of a pull request, right? Where someone just has an argument over a pull request comments, whether they see the company going in this way or that way, and how many thumbs up do you need to merge this pull request? I'm actually curious to. I'll take a look to see the change log there. But do you remember any such, value that got discussed, passionately over the issue tracker?
I think one value that's always going to be very passionate, as it should be, is the value of diversity and inclusion. What does that mean? What does that mean to who? And how do we make sure that we are very responsible and intentional around our practices there? Yep. But yeah, the change log is really informative. And if you want to see any change that happened in GitLab's values, the history is all there.
Yeah, of all the time that I've spent in the handbook and in the issues, the onboarding issue is a favorite of mine because it shows you all the things that you guys have encountered and that any company can encounter. So that's very informative. But I would have never expected that the values themselves go through these minimum viable changes that you described.
Yeah, and everything can go through those minimum viable changes. And that's another part of our values, is that iterative model. So instead of changing everything all at once, how do we take steps to see what those changes are going to ultimately result in? And if we need to adjust our course of action, we can, because we haven't completely overhauled something. We've taken small steps to get to hopefully our end result.
Okay, so I know it's hard, one last, do you think there are any phases that you can remember, like even from your arrival at 80 to 100 people to now almost 800, if you had to say, well, there was a phase when we were still doing X, or when we were still a company that, I'm trying to distill this to something that other, founders or companies can sort of chart in terms of the maturity of a remote organization. Have you experienced or do you feel like there was like the steps of experience and you're like, oh, well, that was a phase before we knew something? And if not, we can drop it. I know I'm almost asking the same question again that I did originally.
No. And that's completely fair. Let me try to see if I can, I don't know if I can quantify it into certain stages, if that makes sense.
Sometimes it's very narrative. Like it's not. But it's even more interesting to me to hear of it in a less quantitative and more qualitative way.
Right. No, but that is a really interesting point, because I do think it could be put into stages. I'm not sure if I have the answer for you right now. One piece is saying I don't know when you don't know. And there are a lot of different phases that different companies are going to go through, and depending on their growth, their trajectory, and what their challenges are. And so it might be very independent for each organization, but there probably are a lot of themes. And I'm lucky enough to belong to some really cool remote Slack groups for different compensation and HR professionals. And I think that, if we pulled all of them and, said, what were your different challenges?
What are some of those? I'd love to know those, because, I think a lot of people, that might hear this later, what are some of those groups that you go to for sort of validation, verification for best practices?
Yeah, it's a couple different Slack groups, one specific on compensation, and then a couple specific around, remote people and people operations and HR, and just different professionals that it's sort of a safe space to collaborate and say, hey, what are your challenges? What are you facing? How did you solve this? What was some of the context behind why you ended up with the result that you did? And, it's really cool to see what other, professionals in this realm of remote work and human resources and people on what we're doing and how we're doing it. And so they're private groups, but it's for pretty much any people professional that is working in that remote setting.
I'll ask you offline maybe, and you can either post them in the notes or, it's funny that you would say that, because as I was preparing for this, the pilot team, another YC company that does exactly this, they help you onboard remote people. They did a really good workshop last week here in San Francisco, and I attended that. And I was just emailing them saying, hey, do you guys want to create a Slack group for this? Part of this. So I knew that something had to exist, and I actually asked them, is there one already? We don't need to reinvent the wheel. So I'd love to see what those groups that already exist are saying, are doing.
Sure, absolutely.
There's definitely a lot of companies are doing what I'm doing, are looking up to GitLab, to Buffer, to Envision, to whatever is being posted by those that are also transparent and public as well as remote. And it's tricky, right? Because you can't just copy. What works for a 700-person organization doesn't work for a 10-person organization, right?
Yeah, and every organization does a little differently. We have some representatives from Buffer and Envision in some of those groups, and one thing that we all can agree on is that we don't all agree on what the remote best practices are, which can make this even more interesting conversation. And so that's one piece that's it depends on what you want to do. What is your philosophy? And I think that's really for any stage, whether that's for how to build a remote company, how to set a compensation philosophy. What is your goal? What do you want your philosophy to be? And then build on it from there. But, I think that's sometimes the hardest question is what do you believe for a remote company?
Yeah, I think in one of these talks, Sid says that he actually has done things differently than the Basecamp guys, but when you see what the Basecamp guys say, he doesn't disagree with it. But it's actually in your actions that, in the detail, the devil's in the details, as they say. So let me see if I can, get a couple of other things that are interesting to us that we're going through. Benefits is one thing that we're struggling with right now, right? We're trying to, you grow from 10 to 20, and then you start having international people. Is there a core set of benefits that, you've seen sort of needing to be there for competitive, market reasons versus a nice to have set of benefits, or like a phase 1, phase 2, maybe even phase 3 set of benefits? You're like, yeah, one day we'll have the gym, but will it be phase 1 or phase 2? What do you see as a benefits person as being the core set of benefits that you need to offer these days?
Yeah, I think it depends. First, how many different countries do you in? And do you want to offer benefits globally to all be the same, or do you want to offer them to be location independent? So that kind of goes back to what's your philosophy on compensation and benefits. We take a location-specific approach to both compensation and benefits, where we say we pay based on local market and what would be standard or statutory in that area. So our benefits might differ from, for instance, the UK to the US to Germany to some of the other entities or co-locations that we have. And the first phase for us would be understanding the market in those different areas, both for comp and benefits. I think it's pretty much the same there on understanding what that means. What is local market? What would be competitive? And what are like companies doing that maybe have a brick and mortar in that area? And then phase 2 would, be understanding what do you want to offer? What level of benefits? What type of benefit? Medical, pension, different perks, maybe a wellness benefit like a gym membership, an employee assistance program around mental health and awareness, things like that. So
you see, all those things feel like, so, I've had them, I've been part of big organizations. It doesn't feel like the benefit that I have to worry about that I would love to worry about it. Don't get me wrong, at a 5 or 10 person organization. So this is almost independent of remote. It's related to remote, of course, because it makes it harder to offer this remote, internationally. But do you see those types of benefits as something that are interesting, crucial early on, or is that something that you see companies wait until they're a little bigger?
Companies typically, from my experience, wait until they're a little bit bigger to offer some of the perks. Some of the other benefits, like a medical or a pension scheme, those are a lot of times mandatory. So that's really understanding what is statutory and then what's preferred, or what's
are you mandatory even when you're doing what I think almost everybody's doing, which is still consider people contractors, even though you're not. And if you actually test it, it's the risk management of, hopefully you don't have an employee in France, another country that's come up in these talks, that tests this, very quickly.
Right.
So, even when you treat an employee as a contractor, because for remote reasons you don't have, I don't think it's called Nexus. It's called Nexus here in the U.S. for the states, right? But when you have a remote entity, a permanent establishment, you can do things differently. You have to do things differently when you have a permanent establishment. So even in those cases, you do see it also as statutory, or do you early on just take the risk and say, we offer what we offer, and that's what we can do as a contractor basis?
Well, that's a bit of a different question. So it depends on whether you're an employee that's employed through an entity or a contractor who is, contracted through an entity, but not eligible for benefits. So there's a lot of government regulations as well around offering benefits to contractors, and if they are truly a contractor based on the work that they're doing. So that's, from a legal perspective, a really important distinction to understand first, before looking at what benefits you're going to offer. So for us, where we don't have an entity or a co-employer and somebody is a contractor, they have a different compensation. They have their benefits built into their compensation with an additional 17% additive into our compensation calculator.
The multiple was one of the things that I wanted to ask about. How did you guys come up with 17%? Is there like a calculator of that calculator where you because 17% might not apply the same to someone in Spain, to someone in Poland, to someone in Nigeria?
Yeah, so what we did is we looked at the global market to see what typically are contractors paid in each location. We ran some statistical regression analysis on our back end with the current team that we had, as well as the survey data that we had. And we came up with the 17% as our own internal number that we calculated. It wasn't from an external source. Yeah.
Well, that's good to know, right? Because I know you point to Numbeo for the cost of living adjustment, but I was curious where that 17% came from.
Yeah, it came from our own analysis based on our team, as well as, data that we had around contractors and, understanding. And then we tested it in, different people that we've hired since then, and it's been operating. There's some countries where it may not be operating optimally, so it's something that we would look at. I know, for instance, Israel might be really expensive to be a contractor, but a lot of times the countries where it's really expensive to be a contractor, do we need to look at perhaps offering an employment relationship? So not to say that we haven't looked at or have looked at or, will offer that employment relationship there. But it's a piece of the analysis that is really important to say whether we should be offering an employment contract, a contractor, contract. And, that also goes back to our tax and legal team that really helps advise us on, what is the risk there? What is the mitigated risk of, being a contractor? Is it legal to be a contractor in this location? And then taking it from there. But so far, the 17% for the most part has been working in most countries.
Good. Yeah, I guess most of that risk is, sort of worked out during the first 100 employees. So that's why, you probably didn't have to deal with that problem. And, it is one of the ones I think a lot of people early on, the pilot team was telling us, until you have 5 people in a country, people don't really worry about this, and they might find a professional employment organization to help, but not even, they just have 1 or 2 contractors that, if somebody wanted to test it, probably could test that they're not really contractors. But good. So let's see what a couple of the things, either, any vendors that you think you've worked with that are particularly good, that like get the remote manifesto that you're like, yeah, you should absolutely talk to this professional employment organization, this benefits, provider, or this, onboarding, like there's the Gustos, Ripplings of the world. Is there one that's particularly good with remote?
Yeah. So from a benefits perspective, the one organization that we've used that's understood GitLab. So I'm not sure if it really is a remote specific, but understood the asynchronous communication feedback has been Treehopper. Yeah. We use them to integrate with Slack to manage our PTO. There's certain locations where you do have to report on PTO and track it and pay out if somebody voluntarily or involuntarily terminates from the company. So it's important for us to have those metrics and understand how much PTO to pay out and why. But we opened up a feedback issue on our issue tracker on People Ops, and they speak directly with our team members and take their feedback directly, implement it, give them updates. And that has been great to see, that direct link between the representatives that we work with at the company, as well as our own team, to say, hey, here's the feedback and here's what we want to see in our pain points and challenges. And we're here to monitor it and kind of help make those ultimate decisions on why or why not to implement maybe a time off type, or how it integrates to our HRIS system. But it's really cool to have that direct link.
Which you guys use Bamboo, I think, is what I read in the in the handbook. So yeah, any other tools, like we're dealing right now with hardware. Do you guys have an IT group, or do you when you have to ship a machine to a new employee, is that done by a third party?
I'm not sure. Our business ops handles, and our G&A and our finance function handles that piece of it. So I'm not sure how that's working, or if they have a preferred vendor. I could reach out to them and ask, and then let you know.
Sure.
But I don't have the answer for you right now.
Yeah, no, I'll maybe collect a few of these more specific questions.
Yeah.
Maybe ask them via email and then document it later.
Yeah, for sure.
And then another thing that's sort of given us a little bit of pain is the whole idea of the Nomad, right? Because there's remote, and then there's the remote Nomad. And I remember a comment Sid made of how the Nomad hasn't been a figure that's worked well at GitLab, at least back when you recorded that particular one about 6 months ago. I don't know if that's evolved or not, but in general, what's your position on Nomads as far as compensation and benefits? Do you have a position? I haven't seen anything specific in the handbook.
Sure. So we, in our handbook, we have a relocation policy that says if you're going to travel for 6 months or less, then it's not considered a relocation. So your compensation would be tied to your country or location of residency. Yep. If you relocate and you move for more than 6 months, then that's considered a relocation. You do a compensation adjustment and you take a look at what the new place that you're moving to is, and that changes not only your compensation, perhaps it might stay the same depending on if you move to the same cost area for market, for example, but it also changes perhaps your tax implications, the contract type that you have. So if somebody were to move out of the US, they wouldn't be able to be an employee of our US entity. They might have to become an employee of another entity that we have perhaps in Germany. And so there's a lot of different implications there on relocations that make a Nomad relationship difficult. But for the most part, people do keep a residency. So that's one thing that I found, and we actually haven't run into this issue often. And when we have, it's been somebody traveling for maybe 4 months. And so it doesn't count as a relocation for our own policy.
Basically do it by keeping their residency of the last place before they went nomadic for a few months.
Right. And for the most part, people do have to keep a residency to get their mail, to file their taxes. There's a lot of different reasons why you'd have a residency.
Yeah, but you can see how that system can be gamed, right? Because if you keep residency in the US and you take a year through Southeast Asia, that's breaking the value or the principle of equanimity, of cost of living. You're taking advantage of something. You're arbitraging salary.
Yeah, everything. The thing that I like to think is everything can be gamed, and what we don't want to do is punish or change our policies for what one person might do when we can handle that case on a one-person basis. People are adults. We want to treat them like adults. And, we hope that they'll be open and honest with us on what they're doing. So if we do have a Nomad that's coming and going to travel for a year, they let us know and we can work something out. We maybe can build a policy around that then afterwards, so that we're continuously consistent from then on out. But we haven't come across it yet to where somebody's been traveling for a year, for example, where they've had to completely not live anywhere, have any residency, and they don't have to pay taxes or rent or own a home anywhere else. And so it's not something we've come across in that manner, but we want to make sure that we open up the lines of communication and people know they can come to us and we can work something out.
Yeah, I think what Buffer describes as doing, and God knows if they're still doing, is they've got the buckets. By now they've evolved into just 3 buckets of cost of living adjustment, and they put all their nomads into the middle bucket.
Right.
So yeah, that is one of the things that when you have a very nomadic team, which we happen to have, you're dealing with this, situation. Anyways, we're hitting the half hour. I don't want to take, too much more of your time.
No problem.
So before I let you go, is there anything in particular that, when we started this conversation, you thought it'd be interesting to tell the world, that I haven't hit on, that you think is interesting and that we should watch for?
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see how remote practices for benefits, compensation, the way that people work, where they live, how they're recruited. It's really interesting to see how that's going to evolve and, what will be discussed 10 years from now. I think, my biggest piece of advice that I would give anyone in the people, department, or somebody starting a company or in Y Combinator, is to understand what your goals are, what your values are as a company, and then, build all these policies and practices around that. So, and then be consistent from then on out. I think one of the keys to people in general and HR is consistency. So treating everybody fairly, making sure you have policies that are administered in that way, but also being able to iterate on them if they perhaps don't make sense as you scale.
Great. Well, I'll be sure to follow up with a couple of these things, and
Yeah.
we'll try to publish something, like we said, that people can benefit from. Thank you very much for your
No,
time.
my pleasure. And if you have any other questions, we can hop on another call, or feel free to send them over